able to put those things in a place where they're not forgotten.
Right, and make separate recommendations at some
Yes.
point in
Yes.
time. But
Absolutely.
our focus is on the ordinance and how it applies to the plan, and not what's good or bad about the plan or what needs to be changed.
Yes.
Is that correct?
There may be, as you get into this work, looking at the common objectives in the comprehensive plan and the policies, and so, well, why isn't there another policy there? I think we'd want to hold on to that and write it down.
Absolutely.
But it's not, your task is large enough, I think, to look at the ordinance, and that's your primary focus.
And that, hold on to it and write it down can be part of the report if the consensus is that it's an irrelevant point to include in the report.
Just and this is a process that I'm suggesting, and in the course of the next several months, we may want to come back and say, you know, there might be another way to do it. But the first, I think, is to get a common understanding among all of you about the comprehensive plan. What is it? How is it structured? You may have some questions about it. If for those of you who've been in other communities, this is a pretty unusual comprehensive plan in that it doesn't have a map. It doesn't have the official map. And Carrie will probably talk about, well, why is that? So it's to understand the comprehensive plan. We will then identify these substantive issues at the right level of detail, not 500,000 feet, but not 3 feet. To then examine how do the UDO, the provisions in the draft UDO carry out the comprehensive plan. And I think that as you get into it, it'll be how effectively does the language that's in the draft carry out that objective or that policy or this collection of policies. As Carrie said, we will propose what is I call it a methodical review, where we think we'll need to go through each objective in the comprehensive plan, work on that objective, complete your set of recommendations on that, go on to the next one. You will find as we get into it that, well, those two objectives seem like they're both looking at similar features in the Unified Development Ordinance. And we have a spreadsheet to try to point out those places where Article 3 in the ordinance relates to Objective 1 and 4 or something. We will, at least I would hope and suggest that with each meeting, if there are recommendations that come out of your discussion, that we will capture those, we will write them down, and we will hold them in a place of, here's where your working recommendations are. We'll come back toward the end of the process and revisit that and say, here's what you said back in August or September. Are you comfortable with that now? We're intending that after 6 or 7 meetings, maybe it will be in November, we're going to have a progress check. My colleagues, Jesse Day from Piedmont Triad Regional Council, who I'm working with and for as your facilitator, will come in and we'll sort of check on how you're going. How has it worked? What would you adjust? Is the pace right? Do we need to speed it up? How can we be more effective? I would hope that at that point we'll make some adjustments and then develop something of an interim report that could be made both through your liaison to the zoning board and to city council, but also to the wider public. And we may want to have a have that be in a public meeting format, not in this room. But I would suggest that we go through 6, 7 meetings and then have that report out to the public. But as in my facilitation, I'm not the content expert here. You're the people who have content expertise and depth of experience in Summerfield. I know planning. I didn't author the ordinance. I didn't author the comprehensive plan. But I see my role as helping you move through your review, following the charge of the town council, so that at the end of these 8 months, you'll feel really good about the set of recommendations that you're making. And between now and then, you keep moving forward. And if there's any spirit that I bring to it, I think that we're around this table and there is common ground. You sure spoke passionately about how much you love Summerfield, what brought you here, and what your concerns are. But that common ground is going to be what will help you as a committee fulfill that charge and develop a set of recommendations. Any questions on process? I know I covered a lot, maybe rambled a bit.
So now let's talk about the legislation and the land use concept.
Thank you. Quietly over here capturing some of your things that draw you to Summerfield as I went through the introductions. My name is Jesse Day. I'm the planning director for the Piedmont Triad Regional Council, so we're excited to be a part of this process. And I just want to echo, we're here to support you, not tell you, kind of how things are done. I will say our region is very big. We work with lots of different communities. We go all the way from Elkin to Yanceyville down to Troy. And I'm in the planning department. We do a lot of other services for our local governments, and so we're excited to help move you all through this process. What I'm going to talk about for about 10, 15 minutes is, sure, I can drive, is about kind of the enabling legislation that allows local governments to enforce zoning, and then talk a little bit about some land use concepts and sort of what, because there's authorizing legislation, but there are limitations to that in terms of what constitutional rights are. So some of you may be familiar with a lot of this information. So, but I want to kind of just as a foundation, is just walk through a little bit about what that legislation is. So of course, you've got different authorities that are granted by the state. We'll talk specifically about the land development pieces. And so that's the zoning, subdivision, housing, and building codes. Then you also have, which we won't talk about tonight, is just sort of general police power, and that charge usually falls on health, safety, and welfare. And then, of course, there's those private property rights, individual rights that are in the Constitution. So what's the chapter? If you wanted to do a lot of fun reading tonight after this meeting, you can go to General Statute 160A. And that, without getting into a lot of specifics tonight, we can provide some more detailed information, but that really covers a lot of the enabling legislation for zoning enforcement. Just to touch on a few things that are key, I think, for this process going forward. It talks about the need to have a land use plan and zoning regulations to be able to enforce that. It's got to be an adopted plan. Establishes planning boards. So Dick's role on the planning board there can be a minimum of 3 members, obviously more than that. You can partner with other communities on a planning board, set up special districts or whatnot. So that legislation allows you to do that. So the planning board does just advise the governing board, which is your town council. There's also in that legislation the Board of Adjustments that deals with appeals to any sort of zoning decisions. It also deals with conditional special use permits through what's called a quasi-judicial process, or variances. So your request for maybe a setback issue that maybe your lot is constraining you to not being able to meet those setbacks. That's a variance. It also talks about how any decisions on changes to that zoning ordinance, either a text change or a district change, which I'll talk about in a little bit, how that needs to be consistent with the land use plan. So that decision on a zoning change, and it's pretty prescribed in terms of what the town board needs to do. So if it is not consistent with the land use plan, you need to make that land use plan consistent with that zoning in order to pass that forward. And so the legislature just got a little more fine-tuned this year on making sure that happens at the same time now. So that was a legislation earlier this year. There are lots of.
I'm sorry, has that been made?
Yeah, that is law. I think that's under the regulatory. There's a lot of other regulatory reforms, and we can get you some details on that.
Okay.
And then there's lots of other authorizing, but also limiting duties that I'll get into in just a second. So this is, of course, what the charge is of the planning board. You're really working for the planning board, so you're really in that lower right-hand corner of the other duties to kind of help with some studies that you're going to pass up to the planning board. You're going to do a lot of work over the next few months. And the planning board will, of course, advise the town council. But those are some of the other charges there: administer the development ordinance, the subdivision, watershed, things like that. What are the types of decisions that we're talking about? So we are really, in this area, we're in that advisory sort of lower right-hand corner there, but these are sort of the types of decisions that a planning board and planning staff do tend to make. This is a tougher one. This is really basically a kind of works like almost like a court. So the difficulty with quasi-judicial decisions is you have to make that decision within the hearing. So your special use, conditional use permits, if that's set up in the UDO potentially, that would need to be, all that information to base that decision on would have to happen within the hearing. Your basic rezonings over here, the planning board members are free to talk, the governing boards members are free to talk outside of the public hearing to get information on that. Conflict of interest issues still apply, but gathering information on those typically need to happen outside the hearing. In some communities, a lot of this is done at the staff level and not at the planning board level. And then, of course, you're gonna get into that sort of advisory and a comprehensive land use plan. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Now, this is just to reinforce kind of what we're talking about here. I think we're going to have some really kind of a range of more broader, long range kind of issues that we throw out on the table, but also some very specific ones that could have some impact immediately. And so each one gets different attention. That's sort of the point of this slide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the legislative charges and some of that limitations. So talk about the consistency among plans. Now, one of the things also that a community can look to, in addition to a comprehensive plan, is maybe a transportation plan or a small area plan. So you could have a smaller subset of the community that's looked at, and that zoning decision could be based within that other plan as well. So it's not just the land use plan. And the interesting thing about North Carolina that differs maybe with other states, maybe it's interesting to me, it's probably not interesting to you, but as a practicing planner, is the prescription for how that land use plan looks is the General Assembly does not give you a prescribed version of a land use plan. So that's an opportunity, but also a challenge of doing planning in North Carolina. In South Carolina, they say, here's our chapters, this is what it's got to look like, and it's much more prescribed. But all that being said, is there's options in terms of what sort of adopted plans. It has to be an adopted plan to point to make that zoning decision. Okay, here's an example of things that of a term that cannot happen within a rezoning, what's called contract zoning. So as a planning board cannot prescribe any sorts of conditions that may be of that rezoning. Whatever uses are allowed in that zone are allowed in that zone. You can't add conditions on top of that. That's really what why conditional use permits became more popular, because of that interest in this sort of a back and forth in terms of maybe the screening or the trees or the look of that. Not allowed in a straight up rezoning. So I talked a little bit about conditional special use permits. These are the quasi-judicial hearings. But it's, you know, it's a good tool for getting, you know, particular specific attributes of that site. But whatever uses are allowed underneath that conditional use permit are allowed. So there's some pitfalls to that, but it does allow that back and forth. But again, all that information has to happen in that evidentiary hearing. So if that's the route we're going to go with the UDO, then you know, keep that in mind. Now, one thing that communities are doing more and more as of late, so say you have a base, maybe you know, a business district, you can set up what's called a conditional zoning district. So it's really it works like that legislative process, and that's much more and more common going forward with communities that are rewriting their zoning ordinances. So it allows some of those conditions, like a conditional use permit, but within a rezoning setting. So as an example, you know, in a lot of those ordinances that are set up, you know, say the developer wants to have a public meeting in advance of the rezoning request, that can be allowed within that conditional district zoning. I know these terms can get a little bit mixed up because you're using conditional use permit and conditional district. So conditional district is that legislative rezoning, conditional use permit, quasi-judicial. And so
We'll go into it more, Jesse. All these, the UDO actually has some of all of these tools in it. So these are various tools that are included in the draft UDO that are used based on appropriateness and relevancy to the case. And we'll go into that more later.
And yeah, and just one last point here, the decision of a Board of Adjustment, if the conditional use permit falls on them, is final. So, which is different with a rezoning, where it is a recommendation to the governing board. Spot zoning. This is you know. Does that house fit in that? No, that's a great visual example of why spot zoning is not allowed. So it is not explicitly illegal, but it is highly discouraged. Obviously, you don't want incompatible land uses, back to the health, safety, and welfare sort of thing. You don't want industrial use within a residential district, and that's why spot zoning in some states is illegal. But you know, your land use plan needs to be really, really strong, which it is, to discourage those types of spot zonings. Now, I'm going to finish with some design standards and aesthetic regulations. So this has come up a lot in the last couple of years in terms of local communities working on design standards. These are allowed in commercial, industrial, and multifamily districts. Some of the aesthetic regulations are not allowed within single-family and duplex residential land uses. So design guidelines, though, can be used in history. The only area where you could do that with a residential district would be a historic district. And that's the intent, you know, with some design guidelines to preserve natural and cultural heritage, boost environmental health, and then you know, encourage community interaction, involvement, consistency of look and feel of a district, and then help support other investments nearby. And so local governments could establish these design guidelines. It's usually you know, put into sort of like a small area plan locations, a small subsection of the community. And so you can have some architectural review, but you need to follow the strict procedural guidelines, be based on a clear set of those guidelines, and then maybe subject to a quasi-judicial process to work out some of those details. Now, I want to show you with this last slide is sort of where, what the town of Summerfield could talk about with residential design standards and what's really not allowed. So, you know, you can work on height and bulk and, you know, density that falls under that. Orientation, location on the lot, you know, steering away from streams or environmentally sensitive areas. You can prescribe some of the buffering and screening of visual impacts. of course, you're gonna be regulating uses of land, you know, that's pretty straightforward. But some of the things you cannot do, and this is based on the legislation that was passed a couple of years ago, it's controlling exterior color, the type of material, style of roof, where the windows and doors will go, locations of rooms or interior layout. Again, with historic districts, that is allowed, but if you're outside of a historic district with single family or duplex, that's sort of the boundaries that y'all will be working with for those types of land uses. I'll end with that tonight. I've got, here's a couple more resources here if you'd like to look up some further resources on zoning and enabling legislation, as well as the general statutes. And then, and this is Bill's contact information and my contact information if you wanted to reach out to us individually for more information on what we've talked about tonight. But with that, are there any questions on the items that I covered now? Okay.
Jesse, just to clarify, when you said land use plan, this is what the statutes allow, but for Summerfield's purposes, we're really talking about the comprehensive plan.
Yeah, right. So that's a good, I mean, you guys have taken a step that some communities have not done in terms of a comprehensive plan, in terms of building in all those different pieces. So what other communities end up having is, you know, they may have a land use plan, but it doesn't have a policy that really addresses what they need to be looking at. So that's where they rely on some other plans. So you're a step ahead here. So I appreciate it. I will.
Slides with,
Absolutely, I'd love to do that. And if you want specific, I'll try to also put in some more on the legislative links that you can kind of click on as well. So I will say my assistant director Liz Jernigan may be here as well in the future, in our department as well. But we're sort of just kind of backing up Bill with research and other information that he'll need to facilitate. And then in case he gets sick, or can't be here, we'll be here to help facilitate as needed. So, okay, thank you.
thank you, Jesse. Okay, so now Carrie will give us an overview of the comprehensive plan that is in each of your binders and on the Dropbox, the shared Dropbox.
I'm going to use this opportunity to process check for time because we have another opportunity to talk about this later and in more detail at the next meeting. So everybody has read the comprehensive plan, correct?
Yes.
Has everybody had a chance to read it?
Yes.
I feel like we have. Okay, sorry, I have to get back on track here. There we go. The last thing that I want to say to kind of segue between Jesse's presentation and the comprehensive plan is this statement. Good planning is getting in front of potential problems and preparing for quality growth, not to stifle it or remove any individual's rights. And this wraps up North Carolina law on planning. North Carolina law enables us to have good planning, but does not enable us to remove individual property owner rights. And that's why I felt like it was sort of a good wrap-up statement. Comprehensive plan took a couple of years to accomplish with a committee not unlike this committee here. The gentleman in the lower right is on this slide because he was a big part of the comprehensive planning process and is the namesake of the Gordon store at the corner of where the town hall is. So it's always good to remember people like Bill in our as we move forward through planning for the town. The intent of the plan is to create a shared vision. This is just an example of of one of the community meetings where participants were voting by dot on the vision that they created at small groups, in tables of small groups. it's a narrative of what we want Summerfield to be. And that narrative is in the form of policies rather than a land use map. It's always been very important for this Summerfield's councils in the past and during this time to protect an individual's property rights. A land use plan tends to take I know we're mixing up, but tends to identify an area for certain specific types of growth. And council's always been very hesitant to say, your property is going to be targeted for this type of growth. So instead, these policies were set up to apply every policy is applied to every property that's requested for some kind of change in zoning. I'll get into that more later, but that is basically the reason why we don't have a growth plan that shows this will be here and that will be there, is so as to honor individual property rights. I'm going to leave it at that and give it back to you, Andrew, so that we don't, and come back to this later.
Okay, so we have 9 minutes to fulfill our efficiency goal. And so I want to go back to what we talked about before. Has anyone had an epiphany and decided, you know what, I'm a great note taker and I want to be very important and be the secretary of the group?
I have a question. I have.
Oh, you raised your hand.
I know. I'm the secretary. I was a secretary for 10 years, so I know very well how to take minutes, which means I also know how much time is into taking minutes. And so my only concern, I'm happy to do it and support the committee. My only concern is, can you explain a little bit more what time it's going to take after the meeting? Because I only have a limited amount of alone time with my 2 kids, so I want to use a lot of it for research rather than just editing or taking minutes.
Yeah, so the minutes policy I mentioned, I'm going to give to whoever is selected for this, just hits it format. That's a 1-page format.
Oh.
I mean, minutes likely won't fit on a page, but yeah, that gives you a good outline of what's
Is it
required.
just action items
And-
and decisions made and votes?
Yeah,
Versus
yeah,
what
and,
people, like, I want
and
to type in
then,
everything they say and edit it in paragraph form afterwards.
Please, don't.
That's what I did for 10 years.
and it is on town letterhead, and the part that, there's some timing there that you have to get it to our
What,
town clerk.
yeah, what's that?
And it's basically that, it's provided to the committee chair within 15 days of a meeting.
Oh,
And then those signed minutes have to be given to the, provided within 10 days of the approval of the minutes have to be turned back in. So, yeah, you've got some time, it's
We can
not
shoot
2 days.
you can.
Well, and I'll add, if you have an agenda, and I give you a Word version of the agenda, and you have the format set up as a template, you
Yeah.
can finish them that night.
Okay.
If you want to type as you're sitting,
Mhm.
and you're typing into the template based on the agenda, it's really pretty efficient. I mean, you can do it efficiently. I mean, being encouraged.
I know, and everyone's like, you can do it, you can do
And I've
it.
done that before.
If after a
I've
little
taken-
bit I find that I'm not able to fully participate in the committee, can we reevaluate? I have.
That's what the committee says.
So let me hit one administrative component of that, so when I'm not here. So it says that if the secretary is not available for a meeting, it's the chair's responsibility to delegate the role so that the minutes are taken.
I will help too, I promise. I mean, I will be taking notes and, because I have 3 little boys too and.
Yeah, I know,
time's very
everyone
precious, I think we all-
is very busy, so, yeah.
Okay, do we have a motion?
Yeah.
Thank you, Andy.
Second, let's have a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed?
No.
We have a secretary. Okay, so So what's next is going to be our next meeting, and there is a schedule in tab 4 in your binder that shows, our cadence of meetings. I can already
I
see
think it's
some.
in the category.
Oh, I'm sorry, it's ahead of that. It's in the third tab. And if you are going to travel or do anything like that, please let me know. I know I'm going to have some business commitments that will interfere with this also. But we're all committed. I do appreciate, once again, I want to reiterate, this is a big deal, and it's everyone appreciates you all being here. Are there any other things I need to cover before we open up for public comments? If anyone is sent up.
We talked a little bit about the next agenda. I'd like to kind of set the following meeting's agenda, at least generally, before leaving. And in the future, it'll be more about making sure that we are staying on track and capturing everything. I think, Bill, you anticipate establishing substantive issues at the next agenda?
Yeah, the main focus of that meeting will be to identify what are, in your views, in your committee view, are the substantive issues that you will want to use as a lens for looking at the UDO ordinance.
Can you give an example? Would that be helpful? Does anyone, would that be helpful as far as what we're talking about as a, what do you think?
Well, just, and this is purely from hearing what some of you said, maybe several repeat the words rural character. That may be one of the issues that, and we'll have a little exercise to try to tease out other issues that relate to development. I would imagine, without guessing what you also might be concerned about, it's issues of appearance. In the comprehensive plan, there's some talk about the visual appearance of certain development. Density may be an issue.
Water.
Water.
Didn't you mention though that there's a matrix that will show where these things intersect? Because that
We'll have a matrix that will show the comprehensive plan's common objectives and policies and how they relate to the chapters of the articles in the UDO draft. And that may give you a good running start at, well, what are the key issues? The comprehensive plan has loads of value-oriented issues already embedded in it, but I think we'll need to work to highlight, well, what are the